This, O best beloved, is another story of the high and far-off times. In the very middle of those times was a stickly, prickly hedgehog, and he lived on the banks of the turbid Amazon, eating shelly snails and things. And he had a friend, a slow, solid tortoise, who lived on the banks of the turbid Amazon, eating green lettuces and things. So that was all right, best beloved, do you see? But also, and at the same time, in those high and far-off times, there was a painted jaguar, and he lived on the banks of the turbid Amazon too, and he ate everything that he could catch. When he couldn't catch deer or monkeys, he'd eat frogs and beetles. And when he couldn't catch frogs and beetles, he went to his mother jaguar, and she told him how to eat hedgehogs and tortoises. She said to him ever so many times, graciously waving her tail, "My son, when you find a hedgehog, you must drop him into the water, and then he will uncoil. And when you catch a tortoise, you must scoop him out of his shell with your paw." Well, one beautiful night on the banks of the turbid Amazon, painted jaguar found stickly, prickly hedgehog and slow, solid tortoise sitting under the trunk of a fallen tree. They couldn't run away, and so Stickly Prickly curled himself up into a ball because he was a hedgehog, and slow, solid tortoise drew in his head and feet into his shell as far as they would go because he was a tortoise. And so that was all right, best beloved. Do you see? "Now attend to me," said Painted Jaguar, "because this is very important. My mother said that when I meet a hedgehog, I'm to drop him into the water and then he will uncoil. And when I meet a tortoise, I'm to scoop him out of his shell with my paw. Now then, which of you is hedgehog and which is tortoise? Because to save my spots, I can't tell." "Are you sure of what your mummy told you?" said Stickly Prickly Hedgehog. "Are you quite sure?" "Perhaps," she said, "that when you uncoil a tortoise, you must shell him out of the water with a scoop, and when you paw a hedgehog, you must drop him on the shell." "Are you sure of what your mummy told you?" said Slow and Solid Tortoise. "Are you quite sure?" "Perhaps," she said, "that when you water a hedgehog, you must drop him into your paw, and when you meet a tortoise, you must shell him till he uncoils." "I don't think it was like that at all," said Painted Jaguar, but he felt a little puzzled. But please say it again, more distinctly." "When you scoop water with your paw, you uncoil it with a hedgehog," said Stickly Prickly. "Remember that, because it's important." "But," said the tortoise, "when you paw your meat, you drop it into a tortoise with a scoop. Why can't you understand?" "Oh, you're making my spots ache," said Painted Jaguar. "Besides, I didn't want your advice at all. I only wanted to know which of you is hedgehog and which is tortoise." "I shan't tell you," said Stickly Prickly, "but you can scoop me out of my shell if you like." "Aha," said Painted Jaguar, "now I know. You're a tortoise. You thought I wouldn't. Well, now I will." Painted Jaguar darted out his paddy paw just as Stickly Prickly curled himself up. And, of course, Jaguar's paddy paw was just filled with prickles. Worse than that, he knocked Stickly Prickly away and away into the woods and bushes where it was too dark to find him. Then he put his paddy paw into his mouth, and, of course, the prickles hurt him worse than ever. And as soon as he could speak, he said, Now I know he isn't tortoise at all, but..." And then he scratched his head with his unprickly paw. "How do I know that this other is tortoise?" "But I am tortoise," said Slow and Solid. "Your mother was quite right. She said that you were to scoop me out of my shell with your paw." "Well, begin." "You didn't say she said that a minute ago," said Painted Jaguar, sucking the prickles out of his paddy paw. "You said she said something quite different." "Well, suppose you say that I said that she said something quite different. I don't see that it makes any difference, because if she said what you said I said she said, it's just the same as if I said what she said she said. On the other hand, If you think, she said, that you were to uncoil me with a scoop instead of pawing me into drops with a shell, I can't help that, can I? But you said you wanted to be scooped out of your shell with my paw, said Painted Jaguar. Now, if you'll think again, you'll find that I didn't say any. I said that your mother said that you were to scoop me out of my shell, said Slow and Solid. Well, what will happen if I do, said the Jaguar, most sniffily and most cautious. I don't know, because I've never been scooped out of my shell before. But I tell you truly, if you want to see me swim away, you've only got to drop me into the water. I don't believe it, said Painted Jaguar. You've mixed up all the things my mother told me to do with the things you asked me whether I was sure that she didn't say, till I don't know whether I'm on my head or my painted tail. And now you come and tell me something I can understand, and it makes me more mixy than before. My mother told me that I was to drop one of you two into the water, and as you seem so anxious to be dropped, I think you don't want to be dropped. So jump into the turbid Amazon and be quick about it. I warn you that your mummy won't be pleased. Don't tell her I didn't tell you, said Slow and Solid. If you say another word about what my mother said, the Jaguar answered. But he had not finished the sentence before Slow and Solid quietly dived into the turbid Amazon, swam underwater for a long way, and came out on the bank where Stickly Prickly was waiting for him. Ah, that was a very narrow escape, said Stickly Prickly. I don't like Painted Jaguar. What did you tell him that you were? I told him truthfully that I was a truthful tortoise, but he wouldn't believe it. And he made me jump into the river to see if I was. And I was. And he is surprised. Now he's going to tell his mummy. Just listen to him. They could hear Painted Jaguar roaring up and down among the trees and the bushes by the side of the turbid Amazon till his mummy came. Son, son, said his mother ever so many times, graciously waving her tail, what have you been doing that you shouldn't have done? Now attend to me and remember what I say. A hedgehog curls himself up into a ball, and his prickles stick out every which way at once. By this you may know the hedgehog. I don't like this old lady one little bit, said Stickly Prickly under the shadows of a large leaf. I wonder what else she knows. A tortoise can't curl himself up, the Jaguar went on, ever so many times, graciously waving her tail. He only draws his head and legs into his shell, and by this you may know the tortoise. Oh, I don't like this old lady at all, said Slow and Solid Tortoise. Even Painted Jaguar can't forget those directions. It's a great pity you can't swim, Stickly Prickly. Don't talk to me, said Stickly Prickly. Just think how much better it would be if you could curl up. Oh, this is a mess. Listen to Painted Jaguar. Painted Jaguar was sitting on the banks of the turbid Amazon, sucking prickles out of his paws and saying to himself, can't curl but can swim. Slow Solid, that's him. Curls up but can't swim. Stickly Prickly, that's him. He'll never forget that this month of Sundays, said Stickly Prickly. Here, hold up my chin, Slow and Solid. I'm going to try to learn to swim. May be useful. Excellent, said Slow and Solid. And he held up Stickly Prickly's chin while Stickly Prickly kicked in the waters of the turbid Amazon. Oh, you'll make a fine swimmer yet, said Slow and Solid. Now then, if you can unlace my back plates a little, I'll see what I can do towards curling up. It may be useful. Stickly Prickly helped to unlace Tortoise's back plates, so that by twisting and straining, Slow and Solid actually managed to curl up a teeny wee bit. Excellent, said Stickly Prickly. But I shouldn't do any more just now. It's making you black in the face. Now then, kindly lead me into the water once again, and I'll practice that side stroke that you say is so easy. And so, Stickly Prickly practiced, and slow and solid swam alongside. Excellent, said Slow and Solid. Why, a little more practice will make you a regular whale. Now then, if I may trouble you to unlace my back and front plates just 2 holes more, I'll try that fascinating bend that you say is so easy. Won't Painted Jaguar be surprised? Excellent, said Stickly Prickly, but it's straining your back plates a little. Hey, they're all overlapping now instead of lying side by side. Oh, that's the result of exercise, said Slow and Solid. And I've noticed that your prickles seem to be melting into one another, and you're growing to look rather more like a pine cone and less like a chestnut burr than you used to. Am I? Said Stickly Prickly. Well, that comes from my soaking in the water. Oh, won't Painted Jaguar be surprised? Well, they went on with their exercises, each helping the other till morning came. And when the sun was high, they rested and dried themselves. Then they saw that they were both of them quite different from what they had been. Stickly Prickly, said Tortoise after breakfast, I'm not what I was yesterday, but I think I may yet amuse Painted Jaguar. That was the very thing I was thinking just now, said Stickly Prickly. Ooh, I think scales are a tremendous improvement on prickles, to say nothing of being able to swim. Oh, won't Painted Jaguar be surprised? Let's go and find him. By and by they found Painted Jaguar, still nursing his paddy paw that had been hurt the night before. And he was so astonished that he fell 3 times backwards over his own painted tail without ever stopping. Good morning, said Stickly Prickly. And how is your dear gracious mummy this morning? Oh, she's quite well, thank you, said Painted Jaguar, but you really must forgive me if I don't at this precise moment recall your name. Well, that's unkind of you, said Stickly Prickly, seeing that this time yesterday you tried to scoop me out of my shell with your paw. But you hadn't any shell. It was all prickles, said Painted Jaguar. I know it was. Look, just look at my paw. You told me to drop into the turbid Amazon and be drowned, said Slow and Solid. Why are you so rude and forgetful today? Don't you remember what your mother told you, said Stickly Prickly? Can't curl but can swim. Stickly Prickly, that's him. Curls up but can't swim. Slow and Solid, that's him. Ha! Then they both curled themselves up and rolled round and round Painted Jaguar till his eyes turned truly cartwheels in his head. Then he went to fetch his mother. Mother, he said, there are 2 new animals in the woods today. And the one that you said couldn't swim, swims. And the one that you said couldn't curl up, curls. And they've gone shares in their prickles, I think, because both of them are scaly all over. And instead of one being smooth and the other being very prickly. And besides that, they're rolling round and round in circles. And I don't feel comfy. Son, said Mother Jaguar ever so many times, graciously waving her tail. A hedgehog is a hedgehog, and can't be anything but a hedgehog. And a tortoise is a tortoise and can never be anything else. But it isn't a hedgehog and it isn't a tortoise. It's a little bit of both, and I don't know its proper name. Nonsense, said Mother Jaguar. Everything has its proper name. I should call it armadillo until I found out the real one. And I should leave it alone. So Painted Jaguar did as he was told, especially about leaving them alone. But the curious thing is that from that day to this, O best beloved, no one on the banks of the turbid Amazon has ever called Stickly Prickly and Slow Solid anything except armadillo. There are hedgehogs and tortoises in other places, of course. There are some in my own garden. But the real old and clever kind, with their scales lying lippity-lappity one over the other, like pine-cone scales, that lived on the banks of the turbid Amazon in the high and far-off days, are always called armadillos because they were so clever. So that's all right, best beloved. Do you see? Now this is the next tale, and it tells how the camel got his big hump. In the beginning of years, when the world was so new and all, and the animals were just beginning to work for man, there was a camel, and he lived in the middle of a howling desert because he didn't want to work, and besides, he was a howler himself. So he ate sticks and thorns and tamarisks and milkweed and prickles, most excruciating idle. And when anybody spoke to him, he said, "Humph," just humph and no more. Presently the horse came to him on Monday morning with a saddle on his back and a bit in his mouth, and said, "Camel, oh camel, come out and trot like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the horse went away and told the man. So presently the dog came to him with a stick in his mouth and said, "Camel, oh camel, come and fetch and carry like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the dog went away and told the man. Presently the ox came to him with the yoke on his neck and said, "Camel, oh camel, come and plough like the rest of us." "Humph," said the camel, and the ox went away and told the man. At the end of the day, the man called the horse and the dog and the ox together and said, "Three, oh three, I'm very sorry for you with the world so new and all. But that humph thing in the desert can't work, or he would have been here by now. So I'm going to leave him alone. And you must work double time to make up for it." That made the three very angry with the world so new and all, and they held a palaver and an indaba and a punchayet and a powwow on the edge of the desert. And the camel came chewing milkweed, most excruciating idle, and laughed at them. Then he said, "Humph," and went away again. Presently there came along the djinn in charge of all deserts, rolling in a cloud of dust. Djinns always travel that way because it's magic. And he stopped to palaver and powwow with the three. "Oh, djinn of all deserts," said the horse, "is it right for anyone to be idle with the world so new and all?" "Certainly not," said the djinn. "Well," said the horse, "there's a thing in the middle of your howling desert, and he's a howler himself, with a long neck and long legs, and he hasn't done a stroke of work since Monday morning. He won't trot." said the djinn, whistling. "That's my camel for all the gold in Arabia. What does he say about it?" "He says humph," said the dog, "and he won't fetch and carry." "Does he say anything else?" "Only humph, and he won't plough," said the ox. "Very good," said the djinn. "I'll humph him if you'll kindly wait a minute." The djinn rolled himself up in his dust cloak and took a bearing across the desert and found the camel most excruciating idle, looking at his own reflection in a pool of water. "My long and bubbling friend," said the djinn, "what's this I hear of your doing no work with the world so new and all?" "Humph," said the camel. The djinn sat down with his chin in his hand and began to think a great magic, while the camel looked at his own reflection in the pool of water. "You have given the three extra work ever since Monday morning, all on account of your excruciating idleness," said the djinn. And he went on thinking magics with his chin in his hand. "Humph," said the camel. "I shouldn't say that again if I were you," said the gin. "You might say it once too often. Bubbles, I want you to work." And the camel said "Humph" again. But no sooner had he said it than he saw his back that he was so proud of puffing up and puffing up into a great big lolloping humph. "Do you see that?" said the gin. "That's your very own humph that you've brought upon your very own self by not working. Today is Thursday, and you've done no work since Monday when the work began. Now you're going to work." "But how can I," said the camel, "with this humph on my back?" "That's made a purpose," said the gin, "all because you missed those 3 days. You'll be able to work now for 3 days without eating, because you can live on your humph. And don't you ever say I never did anything for you. Come out of the desert now and go to the 3 and behave. Humph yourself." And the camel humphed himself, humph and all, and went away to join the 3. And from that day to this, the camel always wears a humph. We call it hump now, so as not to hurt his feelings. But he has never yet caught up with the 3 days that he missed at the beginning of the world, and he has never yet learned how to behave. In the high and far-off times, the elephant, O best beloved, had no trunk. He had only a blackish, bulgy nose, as big as a boot, that he could wriggle about from side to side, but he couldn't pick things up with it. But there was one elephant, a new elephant, an elephant's child, who was full of satiable courteosity. And that means he asked ever so many questions. And he lived in Africa, and he filled all Africa with his satiable courteosities. He asked his tall aunt, the ostrich, why her tail feathers grew just so, and his tall aunt, the ostrich, spanked him with a hard, hard claw. He asked his tall uncle, the giraffe, what made his skin spotty, and his tall uncle, the giraffe, spanked him with his hard, hard hoof, and still he was full of satiable courteosity. And he asked his broad aunt, the hippopotamus, why her eyes were red. And his broad aunt, the hippopotamus, spanked him with her broad, broad hoof. And he asked his hairy uncle, the baboon, why melons tasted just so. And his hairy uncle, the baboon, spanked him with his hairy, hairy paw. And still he was full of satiable courteosity. He asked questions about everything that he saw or heard or felt or smelt or touched, and all his uncles and his aunts spanked him, and still he was full of satiable courteosity. Well, one fine morning in the middle of the precession of the equinoxes, this satiable elephant's child asked a new fine question that he'd never asked before. He asked, what does the crocodile have for dinner? Then everybody said, hush, in a loud and dreadful tone, and they spanked him immediately and directly without stopping for a long time. By and by, when that was finished, he came upon Colo Bird, sitting in the middle of a wait-a-bit thorn bush. And he said, my father spanked me and my mother has spanked me. All my aunts and uncles have spanked me for my satiable courteosity, and still I want to know what the crocodile has for dinner. Then Colo Bird said with a mournful cry, go to the banks of the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, and find out. Well, that very next morning, when there was nothing left of the equinoxes, because the precession had proceeded according to precedent, this satiable elephant's child took 100 pounds of bananas, the little short red kind, and 100 pounds of sugar cane, the long purply kind, and 17 melons, the greeny crackly kind, and said to all his dear families, goodbye, I'm going to the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, to find out what the crocodile has for dinner. And they all spanked him once more for luck, though he asked them most politely to stop. Then he went away, a little warm, but not at all astonished, eating melons and throwing the rind about because he couldn't pick it up. Well, he went from Grahamstown to Kimberley, and from Kimberley to Karma's country, and from Karma's country he went east by north, eating melons all the time, till at last he came to the banks of the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, precisely as Kolo Bird had said. Now you must know and understand, O best beloved, that till that very day and week and hour and minute, this satiable elephant's child had never even seen a crocodile and didn't know what one was like. It was all his satiable curiosity. Well, the first thing he found was a bi-coloured python rock snake curled round a rock. "Excuse me," said the elephant's child most politely, "but have you seen such a thing as a crocodile in these promiscuous parts?" "Have I seen a crocodile?" said the bi-coloured python rock snake in a voice of dreadful scorn. "What will you ask me next?" "Excuse me," said the elephant's child, "but could you kindly tell me what he has for dinner?" Then the bi-coloured python rock snake uncoiled himself very quickly from the rock and spanked the elephant's child with his scalesome, flailsome tail. "Oh, that's odd," said the elephant's child, "because my father and my mother and my uncle and my aunt, not to mention my other aunt, the hippopotamus, and my other uncle, the baboon, have all spanked me for my satiable curiosity. Well, I suppose this is the same thing." So he said goodbye very politely to the bi-coloured python rock snake and helped to coil him up on the rock again and went on, a little warm, but not at all astonished, eating melons and throwing the rind about because he couldn't pick it up, till he trod on what he thought was a log of wood at the very edge of the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees. But it was really the crocodile, O best beloved, and the crocodile winked one eye like this. "Excuse me," said the elephant's child most politely, "but do you happen to have seen a crocodile in these promiscuous parts?" Then the crocodile winked the other eye and lifted half his tail up out of the mud, and the elephant's child stepped back most politely because he didn't wish to be spanked again. "Come hither, little one," said the crocodile. "Why do you ask such things?" "Excuse me," said the elephant's child most politely, "but my father has spanked me, my mother has spanked me, not to mention my tall aunt, the ostrich, and my tall uncle, the giraffe, who can kick ever so hard, as well as my broad aunt, the hippopotamus, and my hairy uncle, the baboon, and including the bi-coloured python rock snake with the scalesome, flailsome tail just up the bank, who spanks harder than any of them. And so if it's all quite the same with you, I don't want to be spanked any more." "Come hither, little one," said the crocodile, "for I am the crocodile." And he wept crocodile tears to show that it was quite true. Then the elephant's child grew all breathless and panted and kneeled down on the bank and said, "You are the very person I've been looking for all these long days. Will you please tell me what you have for dinner?" "Come hither, little one," said the crocodile, "and I'll whisper." Then the elephant's child put his head down close to the crocodile's musky, tusky mouth, and the crocodile caught him by his little nose, which up to that very week, day, hour, and minute had been no bigger than a boot, though much more useful. "I think," said the crocodile, and he said it between his teeth like this, "I think today I will begin with elephant's child." At this, O best beloved, the elephant's child was much annoyed, and he said, speaking through his nose like this, let go, please, you're hurting me." Then the bi-coloured python rock snake scuffled down from the bank and said, My young friend, if you do not now immediately and instantly pull as hard as ever you can, it is my opinion that your acquaintance in the large patent leather ulster, by this he meant the crocodile, will jerk you into yonder limpid stream before you can say Jack Robinson. This is the way bicoloured python rock snakes always talk. Then the elephant's child sat back in his little haunches and pulled and pulled and pulled, and his nose began to stretch, and the crocodile floundered into the water, making all creamy with great sweeps of his tail, and he pulled and pulled and pulled, and the elephant's child's nose kept on stretching, and the elephant's child spread all his little forelegs and pulled and pulled and pulled, and his nose kept on stretching. And the crocodile thrashed his tail like an oar, and he pulled and pulled and pulled, and at each pull the elephant's child's nose grew longer and longer, and oh, it hurt him hideous. Then the elephant's child felt his legs slipping, and he said through his nose, which was now nearly 5 feet long, "This is too much for me." Then the bicoloured python rock snake came down from the bank, knotted himself into a double clove hitch round the elephant child's hind legs, and said, "Rash and inexperienced traveller, we will now seriously devote ourselves to a little high tension, because if we do not, it is my impression that yonder self-propelling man of war with the armour-plated upper deck," by this, O best beloved, he meant the crocodile, "will permanently vitiate your future career." That's the way all bicoloured python rock snakes always talk. So he pulled, and the elephant's child pulled, and the crocodile pulled, but the elephant's child and the bicoloured python rock snake pulled hardest. And at last, the crocodile let go of the elephant's child's nose with a plop that you could hear all up and down the Limpopo. Then the elephant's child sat down most hard and sudden. But first he was careful to say thank you to the bicoloured python rock snake. And next he was kind to his poor pulled nose, and he wrapped it all up in cool banana leaves and hung it in the great grey-green greasy Limpopo to cool. "What are you doing that for?" said the bicoloured python rock snake. "Excuse me," said the elephant's child, "but oh, my nose is badly out of shape, and I'm waiting for it to shrink." "Then you'll have to wait a long time," said the bicoloured python rock snake. "Some people don't know what's good for them." Well, the elephant's child sat there for 3 days, waiting for his nose to shrink. But it never grew any shorter, and besides, it made him squint. For, oh, best beloved, you will see and understand that the crocodile had pulled it out into a really, truly trunk, same as all elephants have today. At the end of the 3rd day, a fly came and stung him on the shoulder, and before he knew what he was doing, he lifted up his trunk and hit that fly dead with the end of it. "Vantage number 1, said the bicoloured python rock snake. "You couldn't have done that with a mere smear nose. Try and eat a little now." And before he thought what he was doing, the elephant's child put out his trunk and plucked a large bundle of grass, dusted it clean against his forelegs, and stuffed it into his own mouth. "Vantage number 2, said the bicoloured python rock snake. "You couldn't have done that with a mere smear nose. Now then, don't you think the sun is very hot here?" "It is," said the elephant's child. And before he thought what he was doing, he slooped up a sloop of mud from the banks of the great grey-green greasy Limpopo and slapped it on his head, where it made a cool, sloopsy, slushy mud cap, all nice and trickly behind his ears. "Vantage number 3, said the bicoloured python rock snake. "Now, you couldn't have done that with a mere smear nose. Now, how do you feel about being spanked again?" "Excuse me," said the elephant's child, "but I should not like it at all." "Well, how How would you like to spank somebody? Said the bi-coloured python rock snake. I should like it very much indeed, said the elephant's child. Well then, said the bi-coloured python rock snake, you will find that new nose of yours very useful to spank people with. Thank you, said the elephant's child. I'll remember that. And now I think I'll go home to all my dear families and try. So the elephant's child went home across Africa, frisking and whisking his trunk. When he wanted fruit to eat, he pulled fruit down from a tree instead of waiting for it to fall as he used to. And when he wanted grass, he plucked grass up from the ground instead of going on his knees as he used to. And when the flies bit him, he broke off the branch of a tree and used it as a fly whisk. And he made himself a new, cool, slushy, squashy mudcap whenever the sun was hot. When he felt lonely walking through Africa, he sang to himself down his trunk, and the noise was louder than several brass bands. And he went especially out of his way to find a broad hippopotamus. She was no relation of his, and he spanked her very, very hard to make sure that the bi-coloured python rock snake had spoken the truth about his new trunk. The rest of the time he picked up the melon rinds that he dropped on his way to the Limpopo, for he was a tidy packeter. And one dark evening he came back to all his dear families, and he coiled up his trunk and said, how do you do? Oh, and they were very glad to see him, and immediately said, come here and be spanked for your satiable courteosity. Pooh, said the elephant's child. I don't think you peoples know anything about spanking, but I do, and I'll show you. Then he uncurled his trunk and knocked two of his dear brothers head over heels. Oh, bananas, said they. Where did you learn that trick? And what have you done to your nose? Oh, I got a new one from the crocodile on the banks of the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, said the elephant's child. I asked him what he had for dinner, and he gave me this to keep. Well, it looks very ugly, said his hairy uncle the baboon. It does, said the elephant's child, but it's very useful, and he picked up his hairy uncle the baboon by one hairy leg and hove him into a hornet's nest. Then that bad elephant's child spanked all his dear families for a long time till they were all very warm and greatly astonished. He pulled out his tall ostrich aunt's tail feathers, and he caught his tall uncle the giraffe by the hind leg and dragged him through a thorn bush. And he shouted at his broad aunt the hippopotamus and blew bubbles in her ear when she was sleeping in the water after meals. Well, at last things grew so exciting that his dear families went off one by one in a hurry to the banks of the great grey, green, greasy Limpopo River, all set about with fever trees, to borrow new noses from the crocodile. And when they came back, nobody spanked anybody anymore. And ever since that day, O best beloved, all the elephants that you will ever see, besides all those that you won't, have trunks precisely like the trunk of the satiable elephant's child. Once upon a time, on an uninhabited island on the shores of the Red Sea, there lived a Parsee, from whose hat the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the Parsee lived by the Red Sea with nothing but his hat and his knife and a cooking stove of the kind that you must particularly never touch. And one day he took flour and water and currants and plums and sugar and things and made himself one cake which was 2 feet across and 3 feet thick. It was indeed a superior comestible. That's magic. And he put it on the stove because he was allowed to cook on that stove. And he baked it and he baked it till it was all done brown and smelled most sentimental. But just as he was going to eat it, there came down to the beach from the altogether uninhabited interior one rhinoceros with a horn on his nose, 2 piggy eyes, and very few manners. In those days, the rhinoceros's skin fitted him quite tight. There were no wrinkles in it anywhere. As a matter of fact, he looked exactly like a Noah's Ark rhinoceros, but of course much, much bigger. All the same, he had no manners then, and he has no manners now, and he never will have any manners. He said, "How?" And the Parsee left that cake and climbed to the top of a palm tree with nothing on but his hat, from which the rays of the sun were always reflected in more than oriental splendor. Then the rhinoceros upset the oil stove with his nose, and the cake rolled on the sand, and he spiked that cake on the horn of his nose, and he ate it. And he went away, waving his tail to the desolate and exclusively uninhabited interior, which, as you know, abuts on the islands of Mazander and Socotra and the promontories of the larger equinox. And then the Parsee came down from his palm tree, put the stove on its legs, and recited the following sloka, which, as you have not heard, I will now proceed to relate. Them that takes cakes which the Parsee man bakes makes dreadful mistakes. And there was a good deal more in that than you would think, because 5 weeks later there was a heat wave in the Red Sea, and everybody took off all the clothes they had. The Parsee took off his hat, but the rhinoceros took off his skin and carried it over his shoulder as he came down to the beach to bathe. In those days, it buttoned underneath with 3 buttons and looked just like a waterproof. He said nothing whatever about the Parsee's cake because he'd eaten it all, and he'd never had any manners then, since, or henceforward. He waddled straight into the water and blew bubbles through his nose, leaving his skin on the beach. Presently the Parsee came by and found the skin, and he smiled one smile that ran all round his face 2 times. Then he danced 3 times round the skin and rubbed his hands. Then he went to his camp and filled his hat with cake crumbs, for the Parsee never ate anything but cake, and he never swept out his camp. And he took that skin, and he shook that skin, and he scrubbed that skin, and he rubbed that skin just as full of old, dry, stale, tickly cake crumbs and some burned currants as ever it could possibly hold. Then he climbed to the top of his palm tree and waited for the rhinoceros to come out of the water and put it on. And the rhinoceros did. He buttoned it up with the 3 buttons, and it tickled like cake crumbs in bed. Then he wanted to scratch, but that made it worse. Then he lay down on the sands and rolled and rolled and rolled, and every time he rolled, the cake crumbs tickled him worse and worse and worse. Then he ran to the palm tree and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed himself against it. He rubbed so much and so hard that he rubbed his skin into a great fold over his shoulders and another fold underneath, where the buttons used to be, but of course he'd rubbed the buttons off. And he rubbed some more folds over his legs. And it spoiled his temper, but it didn't make the least bit of difference to the cake crumbs. They were inside his skin, and they tickled. So he went home, very angry indeed, and horribly scratchy. And from that day to this, every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all on account of the cake crumbs inside. But the Parsee came down from his palm tree, wearing his hat from which the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor, packed up his cooking stove, and went away in the direction of Orotava, Amygdala, the upland meadows of Arantarivo, and the marshes of Sonneborn.